In the 17th century, Portugal was building an empire in Central Africa. But there was one African ruler it could not simply intimidate, capture, or remove. Her name was Njinga. She negotiated with Portuguese governors. She built armies. She formed alliances with African kingdoms, and even with the Dutch. And in 1647, her forces helped deliver a devastating defeat to a Portuguese army at the Battle of Cumbe. Yet for centuries, outside Angola and the wider African Atlantic world, her story remains strangely peripheral. So who was this woman who spent decades fighting one of Europe's imperial powers and survived to negotiate peace on her own terms? To understand Njinga, we have to forget the image of Africa as a collection of isolated villages waiting for Europe to arrive. Her world already had kingdoms, rulers, diplomatic traditions, armies, trade networks, and competing political interests. Njinga was born into the ruling family of Ndongo, a state dominated by Mbundu-speaking peoples in West Central Africa. Its position was strategically important. Inland routes connected the kingdom to the Atlantic coast, while Luanda had become a growing Portuguese stronghold. And behind this struggle was a brutal new economic reality, the expanding Atlantic slave trade. Portuguese merchants and military forces wanted greater access to captives and greater control over the routes through which they moved. African rulers, meanwhile, were not simply passive victims. They negotiated, resisted, traded, fought, and sometimes participated in the same systems that were transforming their region. Njinga would eventually become one of the most formidable opponents of Portuguese expansion. But her first weapon was not a sword. It was diplomacy. In 1622, Njinga walked into Luanda not as a conquered queen, but as an ambassador. She had been sent by her brother, the ruler of Ndongo, to negotiate with the Portuguese governor. Imagine the scene: a powerful European colonial representative, an African kingdom under military pressure, and across the room, a woman representing the political interests of her state. Njinga negotiated a settlement that included Portuguese withdrawal from some positions in recognition of Ndongo's sovereignty. She was baptized and took the Christian name Ana de Sousa. For a moment, diplomacy appeared to have worked. But the peace would not last. Within a few years, Portuguese pressure returned. By 1626, Njinga had been driven from Ndongo. And this is where the story changes. Because instead of disappearing, Njinga reinvented herself. Forced away from her ancestral kingdom, Njinga moved westward and built a new political base, Matamba. Here she assembled a remarkable coalition. She attracted warriors, refugees, political allies, and people fleeing Portuguese-controlled territories. She also developed relationships with Imbangala warrior groups and adopted military practices associated with their communities. Matamba became more than a refuge. It became a power center. And Njinga understood something that many rulers before her had learned the hard way, tas rictus. You do not defeat a stronger enemy simply by fighting harder. You change the battlefield. You build alliances. You control movement. You make yourself difficult to predict. And above all, you survive. For the next 3 decades, Portugal would discover just how difficult Njinga was to defeat. Then, in 1641, something extraordinary happened. Portugal's European rival, the Dutch, captured Luanda. Suddenly, the geopolitical balance shifted. Njinga saw an opportunity. She formed an alliance with the Dutch and worked alongside African powers, including Congo, against the Portuguese. This was not a simple story of Africa versus Europe. It was a complicated 17th century geopolitical struggle. African kingdoms pursued their own interests. The Dutch pursued commercial interests. Portugal wanted to preserve its colonial foothold. And Njinga wanted something very specific: political survival, territorial power, and the restoration of her influence over Ndongo. She was not simply reacting to European history. She was making strategy within it. In 1646, Njinga suffered a major setback at Kabanga. Portuguese forces defeated her army. One of her sisters was captured. For a moment, the queen's position looked dangerously weak. But defeat did not end the war. It changed the calculation. Dutch and Congolese support returned. And in October 1647, the forces of Njinga, Matamba, Congo, and their Dutch allies confronted a Portuguese army near Kumbi. This time, the result was dramatically different. Njinga's coalition won. The Portuguese army suffered heavy losses. The victory allowed Njinga and her allies to place several Portuguese strongholds under pressure. This is the moment behind the legend. Not because Njinga conquered Portugal. She didn't. But because an African-led coalition had defeated Portuguese forces in a major engagement, and the Portuguese position in the region became increasingly precarious. But history rarely gives anyone a clean victory. Njinga could defeat Portuguese field armies. What she struggled to do was destroy Portugal's fortified network. Strongholds such as Masangano remained difficult to capture. And then the balance shifted again. In 1648, Portuguese forces, reinforced from Brazil, returned to Luanda. The Dutch were pushed out. The European alliance that had given Njinga such enormous leverage collapsed. The Queen was again confronted by the reality she had spent decades trying to overcome. Portugal could lose battles and still remain in the game. And this may be Njinga's greatest lesson. Winning a battle is not the same thing as winning a war. Power belongs to whoever can continue playing. By the 1650s, Njinga was no longer the young warrior queen of the earlier campaigns. She had survived decades of war. And she now had another weapon available: negotiation. Peace talks with Portugal intensified. Njinga also sought the return of her sister, who had been held by the Portuguese. In 1656, an agreement was reached. Njinga accepted major concessions. She renewed her connection with Catholic Christianity and allowed missionaries greater access to Matamba. The Portuguese, in turn, recognized her position and returned her sister. To some later observers, this looked like surrender, but that interpretation misses something important. Njinga had spent more than 30 years fighting Portugal. She had survived exile, rebuilt a kingdom, defeated Portuguese forces, built international alliances, and remained politically independent. Now, in old age, she was using diplomacy to secure what war could not guarantee. But there is another reason Njinga's story is complicated. She should not be turned into a flawless superhero. She operated in a violent political economy. Her kingdom participated in regional warfare. She also participated in the Atlantic slave trade. That uncomfortable reality matters, because historical justice does not require turning African leaders into saints. It requires allowing them to be human, strategic, ambitious, contradictory, capable of courage, and capable of decisions shaped by the brutal world in which they lived. And there is an even deeper question. If European records preserve so much about Njinga, why did the wider world hear so little about her? The answer is more complicated than saying someone simply erased her. Njinga was never completely forgotten. Portuguese chroniclers wrote about her. European writers later turned her into a controversial and sometimes exoticized figure. African oral traditions preserved her memory, and modern Angolan historians and institutions have reclaimed her as a symbol of resistance. The real problem was something subtler. For generations, global historical narratives centered Europe so heavily that African political actors were often treated as supporting characters in European expansion. Njinga reverses that perspective. Portugal was not the only actor making history in 17th century Angola. Njinga was making history too. Njinga died in 1663, more than 80 years old. She had never been captured. She had survived Portuguese military campaigns, internal rivals, shifting alliances and decades of war. After her death, Matamba continued, but the political balance changed. Yet Njinga's legacy proved more durable than the kingdom she ruled. Today, she stands among the most recognizable figures of Angolan history. Njinga's story is not simply about a queen who fought Portugal. It is about who gets remembered as the author of history, because sometimes history does not need to be rewritten. It needs to be looked at from another side. If Queen Njinga's story changed the way you think about African history, subscribe to the African Lens Tales, like this documentary, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. And when you're ready, watch our next documentary, because Njinga was not the only African leader whose story deserves another lens.